The wind didn't whisper in Wyoming. It carved. It scoured the high plains clean and screamed through the pines of the Absaroka Range with a sound like something dying. The kind of wind that didn't just move snow, it weaponized it. Garrett Thorne felt the pressure drop before he saw the storm. He stood on the porch of his isolated cabin, hands braced on the railing he'd built with Carolyn back in 2018. The wood was weathered, now gray as his temples worn smooth by 4 years of his calloused palms gripping it every morning. Watching, waiting for nothing. He was 39 years old and looked 50. A tall man built with the lean, dangerous efficiency of someone who'd spent a decade as a Navy SEAL before a training accident shattered his right knee and his entire identity along with it. His dark brown hair was cut military short, though he hadn't worn the uniform in 3 years. Silver streaked through it at the temples like frost. His face was all hard angles, jaw, cheekbones, the set of his mouth weathered by sun and wind, and the kind of grief that never fully heals. A close-cropped beard, more salt than pepper, covered the lower half of his face. It hid nothing that mattered. His eyes did that work. They were pale gray, the color of winter sky, and they carried the particular emptiness of a man who'd lost the only thing that ever made the world make sense. He wore what he always wore, faded Carhartt work pants, heavy boots with new laces on old leather, a flannel shirt in deep navy beneath a battered brown leather jacket that Carolyn had given him for his 35th birthday. The jacket's lining was torn. He'd never fixed it. He told himself it was because he didn't have time. The truth lived deeper in a place he didn't examine. At his feet sat Kodiak. Just Kodiak. Never Cody, not out loud, not yet. The dog was a German shepherd, 6 years old, with the kind of presence that made people step back without knowing why. His coat was the classic black and tan, darker than most, the black spreading like spilled ink across his shoulders and down his spine. His eyes were amber sharp and assessing the eyes of an animal that had seen things, survived things, and learned not to trust easily. A jagged scar ran through his left ear where a suspect's knife had gotten too close during his 4th year with San Diego PD. He'd been a K-9 officer for 5 years. Narcotics detection, apprehension, search and rescue. 3 certifications, 2 commendations, and 1 medical retirement when his hips started going bad at 5 years old. Garrett had adopted him 18 months ago from a K-9 rescue organization. He hadn't wanted a dog, he'd wanted to be left alone. But the woman running the rescue had looked at him with the same eyes every VA counselor and well-meaning neighbor had used and said, "You both need each other whether you know it or not." She'd been right. He hated that she'd been right. Kodiak didn't wag his tail when happy. He didn't bark at squirrels. He didn't beg for food or jump on furniture or any of the things normal dogs did. He simply existed alongside Garrett in a parallel grief neither of them discussed. The dog had lost his handler, an officer named Chris Mendoza, to a heart attack at 34. Garrett had lost Carolyn to stage 4 pancreatic cancer in 2021. They were 2 broken things sharing space, and that was enough. Garrett sniffed the air. The smell was sharp metallic. Snow, not the light dusting kind, the kind that buried you. "Generator's full," he said to the dog. Kodiak's ears twitched, but he didn't turn his head. Wood stacked, got 3 weeks of supplies. The sat phone in his pocket buzzed, not rang, buzzed. The vibration was an insult against the silence. Garrett pulled it out, looked at the screen. Maggie Sutherland, his only neighbor for 12 miles, an old woman who left him alone, except for occasional pies on the porch and 1 phone call every few months to check the rental cabin she owned deeper in the mountain when weather came. He answered, "Sutherland." "Oh, thank the Lord, Garrett." Her voice was thin, stretched tight with worry, and crackling with satellite static. "I was afraid I wouldn't catch you before this storm hit proper." "Storm's here, Maggie. You should be in town." I am. I'm in Lander at my sister's. That's why I'm calling. I've got renters up at Aspen Lodge. Young couple. They were supposed to check in yesterday afternoon, but I haven't heard a peep. In this storm, Garrett, the forecast is just terrifying. I have a bad feeling." Garrett's jaw tightened. He looked out at the white void forming beyond his porch. The first fat flakes were beginning to fall thick and wet, the kind that accumulated fast. Aspen Lodge was 5 miles deeper into the wilderness down a logging road that would be impassable within 2 hours. "What do you need, Maggie? Could you just check on them? I know it's asking a lot, and I know you prefer your privacy, but I'm just worried sick. If they're not there, just make sure the door's locked. If they are there, tell them where the emergency kit is under the sink. I tried calling, but the cell service up there, I'm going now." He cut her off, not unkindly. Maggie was good people. She'd brought Carolyn soup during the bad weeks. She'd never asked him questions. That bought her a lot of grace. Bless you, Garrett, I mean it. He ended the call and looked down at Kodiak. The dog was already on his feet, head cocked, waiting, reading him. That was the thing about canines. They didn't just obey, they anticipated. Load up, Garrett said. Kodiak trotted to the old Ford F-250 parked in the gravel drive. The truck was a 2004 primer gray, more rust than paint in some places. But the engine was sound. Garrett kept it that way. It was the only thing he kept maintained besides his weapons and the cabin itself. The drive was slow, methodical, the kind of driving you did when you knew the road could kill you if you weren't paying attention. The logging road was already turning slick, the heavy snow beginning to erase the tire ruts from whoever had come through last. Garrett's hands were steady on the wheel. His eyes scanned the tree line out of habit, threat assessment, angles of approach, exit routes. You never stopped being a SEAL even when the only thing you were fighting was silence. Kodiak sat rigid in the passenger seat, his nose pressed to the crack in the window where cold air whistled in. His ears were up, swiveling tracking sounds Garrett couldn't hear. The dog had been tense since they left, and that was unusual. Kodiak's default state was calm. Watchful, yes. Alert, always. But tense, no. Easy, Garrett murmured. The dog's ears flicked toward him, but his body language didn't change. 23 minutes later, Aspen Lodge came into view through the swirling white. It was smaller than Garrett's cabin, an A-frame with a steep roof designed to shed snow. Dark. No lights in any window. No vehicle in the short gravel driveway that was already disappearing under 3 inches of fresh powder. Garrett pulled up and killed the engine. Silence rushed in, broken only by the howl of wind and the tick of the cooling motor. "They're not here," he said aloud, relief in his voice. "Good." He reached for the door handle. Behind him, the world exploded in sound. Kodiak lost his mind. The dog threw himself against the passenger window with a force that rocked the entire truck. His bark was not the sharp alert of a bug seeing a deer. It was the deep, rapid, frantic alarm of a canine that had found something. Found someone. His paws scrabbled at the door, claws scratching paint, his whole body vibrating with desperate urgency. "Kodiak, knock it off!" Garrett's command was sharp, automatic. The dog didn't stop. If anything, he got louder. His barks turned into howls high and piercing, the kind of sound Garrett had only heard twice before, once when Kodiak had alerted on a live victim buried under debris during a training scenario, and once when a rattlesnake had coiled 2 feet from Garrett's boot on a trail. This wasn't a false alarm. K9s didn't false alarm. Cold dread, the kind that started in your spine and spread like ice water through your chest, settled over Garrett. He opened his door. Kodiak shoved past him before he was fully out, hitting the snow and bolting straight for the cabin's front door. The dog reared up on his hind legs, his front paws slamming against the wood with solid thuds, and he barked, 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 a sound like breaking glass, sharp and wrong in the thick silence of the storm. Garrett moved. Training took over. He crossed the distance in long strides, his boots crunching through snow, his right knee protesting, but holding. His hand went to his hip, automatically reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there. He hadn't carried in 2 years. Hadn't needed to. Out here, the only threats were weather and isolation. Kodiak, heel. The dog ignored him completely. He clawed at the door, whining now, a high, desperate sound in the back of his throat. Garrett reached the porch, scanned. No boot prints in the fresh snow, but it was coming down hard enough to erase tracks in minutes. No broken windows. No signs of forced entry. He put his gloved hand on the doorknob. It turned, unlocked. Every instinct he'd honed over a decade screamed wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. He pushed the door open slowly. "This is Garrett Thorne. Maggie Sutherland asked me to check the cabin." Silence answered, the heavy waiting kind. The interior was freezing. Colder than outside, somehow the kind of cold that meant the heat had been off for hours. No lights. The only illumination came from the gray stormlight filtering through the windows, casting everything in shades of shadow and suggestion. Kodiak pushed past him and disappeared into the darkness. Garrett followed, his eyes adjusted. The cabin's layout was simple. Open concept main room with a kitchenette on one side, a stone fireplace on the other, a hallway leading to a bedroom and bathroom in the back. Standard rental furniture, a worn couch, a small dining table. And in the far corner, barely visible in the gloom, was a shape, a person. Garrett's heart kicked once hard against his ribs. She was sitting in a wheelchair, modern, lightweight, the kind with quick-release wheels and a sleek aluminum frame. But one of the large rear wheels was bent at a sickening angle. Spokes snapped. The whole assembly twisted like it had been hit by something or someone with force. She was wrapped in one of the cabin's decorative throw blankets, the thin, useless kind meant for aesthetics. Her blonde hair hung in tangles around her face. Her skin was pale, not just pale gray, bloodless. Her lips had a faint blue tinge. She was shivering so violently, the wheelchair rattled against the wooden floor. Kodiak was at her side, sniffing his barks, replaced by a low, questioning whine. His training was showing. Check for injuries. Assess the threat. Report. Garrett moved forward, hands visible, movements slow. Ma'am, I'm Garrett. I'm here to help. Her head lifted. Her eyes were wide blue and filled with a terror so absolute it seemed to have frozen her from the inside out. Please don't hurt me. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely above a whisper. I'm not going to hurt you. Garrett kept his tone level, calm, the voice he'd used on missions when civilians were in shock. Are you injured? He left me. The words came out in a stammering rush, her breath hitching. My fiancé, Dominic, we had a fight, and he said I was a burden, and he pushed me, and the chair broke, and he took the car, and he left me here. Garrett's eyes went to the broken wheelchair, then to her. She was wearing expensive clothes. He could tell even in the dim light. A coat that was easily $4,000 Canada Goose, the real thing. Leather gloves, boots that looked custom. And her perfume, faint but unmistakable, was the kind that came in bottles that cost more than his monthly food budget. But no luggage, no phone visible, no purse. Something was off. Kodiak circled her once, sniffing, then sat. He didn't growl, didn't alert, just sat and stared at her with those amber eyes, his head tilted slightly, assessing. Garrett looked at the woman, then at the broken chair, then out the window at the storm, which was no longer a storm, but a full whiteout. The cabin had no firewood, no backup generator. The pipes would freeze within hours. She wouldn't last the night. His cabin was 2 miles back. It was a fortress, warm, stocked, safe. He didn't want this, didn't want another person in his space, in his silence, asking questions or needing things or being there. But the mission, as always, had changed. All right, he moved forward with purpose. We're not staying here. My place is 2 miles back. It's warm, it's safe. She flinched as he approached, pressing back into the chair. I can't. The chair, I see that. He knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes. I'm going to pick you up. We're going to my truck. Do you understand? She stared at him like she couldn't process the words, her body still shaking apart with cold. I'm not asking, ma'am. We're going. He slid one arm under her legs, the other behind her back. She was lighter than he expected. Too light, almost fragile. She let out a small, frightened gasp, but didn't fight him. He lifted her easily, the blanket still wrapped around her, and turned toward the door. Kodiak, heel. The shepherd, his duty as alarm complete, fell into position at Garrett's left side. His ears were up, his body tense, but he moved in sync with Garrett's steps. Years of training didn't fade. Garrett Thorne, a man who had walked away from the world, turned his back on the empty cabin and stepped into the screaming chaos of the storm. The woman trembled in his arms. The dog stayed close. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice that sounded like Carolyn whispered, "You can't save everyone, but you can save her." The 2 miles was a fight. The wind tried to rip the woman from Garrett's arms. The snow was so thick he navigated by memory and instinct. The landscape erased into white nothingness. His knees screamed with every step, but he didn't slow. Couldn't slow. Kodiak pressed against his left leg, a steady, warm pressure, guiding him when visibility dropped to zero. The woman in his arms had stopped shivering. That was worse. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. Stillness meant shutdown. Stay with me, Garrett said, his voice rough against the wind. We're almost there. She didn't respond. Kodiak barked once. Sharp. The cabin was close. 3 minutes later, Garrett kicked the heavy oak door of his cabin open. The sound of the world changed instantly. The deafening howl of the storm was muffled, replaced by the deep, resonant creak of the chimney and the blessed, overwhelming warmth of the interior. Kodiak scrambled inside first, shaking a cloud of snow from his coat. Garrett followed, shouldering the door shut behind him, and the deadbolt slid home with a heavy metallic thunk. Heat hit like a physical force. I'm putting you on the couch. Garrett's voice was clipped. Professional. He carried her to the worn, oversized sofa positioned across from the stone fireplace, where embers still glowed from the morning fire. He set her down carefully. She landed on the cushions, and the sudden warmth must have hurt, because she made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob, as blood began to return to frozen limbs, pins and needles, agony masquerading as relief. Garrett didn't fuss. He moved with economy. Crossed to the fireplace, added 3 split logs to the embers, grabbed the bellows, and worked them until flame caught and spread. Heat rolled into the room in waves. "Stay," he commanded. It took the woman a second to realize he was talking to Kodiak. The dog, who had been sniffing her boots with intense focus, immediately retreated to a circular braided rug near the hearth. He lay down, paws crossed, but his head stayed up, his eyes fixed on her, unblinking, analytical. He wasn't growling, wasn't threatening, just watching. His amber gaze cataloged her smallest movements, assessing the way a trained K9 processed every detail of a scene. Garrett disappeared into the small kitchen area and returned 30 seconds later with a heavy ceramic mug. Steam rose from it in lazy curls. "Coffee, hot, drink it." "Thank you." Her voice was barely audible, trembling. Her hands, when she reached for the mug, shook so violently she almost dropped it. Garrett's hands shot out, catching hers. His palms were rough, warm, radiating heat like stone that had been sitting in the sun. He wrapped her fingers around the mug, holding them there, forcing her to grip it. "Hold it. Feel the heat. Drink." She obeyed, sipped. The coffee was scalding and bitter, and it burned a trail down her throat and into her chest where it ignited a small, desperate fire. My chair," she stammered, trying to make the lie sound solid. "He broke it. It's in the truck. It's useless in this. Snow's already 3 feet at the door. You're not going anywhere." His tone wasn't cruel, just factual. The voice of someone stating an undeniable truth. He was suspicious. She could feel it. It radiated off him like cold, a thick, palpable distrust. This was a man who had walled himself off from the world, and she had just been carried over the ramparts. He moved to a closet and pulled out 2 thick wool blankets. They were clean but old, the color of oatmeal edges, bound in faded satin. He tossed one into her lap. "Cold's in your bones. You need to get warm." He turned his back, giving her privacy. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her coat. The coat alone cost more than everything in this cabin combined. The lie felt heavy and clumsy on her tongue. I can't. My legs. I can't do it alone." Garrett paused, let out a long, slow breath through his nose. Turned back. His gray eyes were hard. "Right." He stepped forward, wrapped the blanket over everything, core temperature first. He didn't offer to help her undress. Just watched, expression unreadable, as she struggled to drape the heavy wool over her damp designer clothes. While she worked, he moved through the cabin with the efficiency of someone performing a pre-mission check. Windows, shutters, securing the perimeter. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into the warm, dancing glow of firelight. Garrett didn't hesitate. He lit 2 oil lamps with practiced ease, their flames casting gentle amber light across the space. "Generator will kick in," he said to the room, "but I prefer the quiet." The quiet, the only sounds now, were the roar of wind outside, the crackle of fire, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the dog. Kodiak had not moved. He was still on his rug, head up, those amber eyes tracking her every micro-expression. His vigilance was unnerving. It was pure animal judgment, the kind she couldn't charm or bribe or lie her way past. And that was when the true weight of her deception began to settle. Isabel Harmon Bell, to anyone who'd known her before the money, sat wrapped in a threadbare blanket in a stranger's cabin. Her net worth was currently sitting at $42 million, give or take whatever the stock market had done in the last week. She was the CEO and founder of TrueRoot Software Solutions, a logistics tracking company she'd built from nothing in 7 years. And she was pretending to be paralyzed. The lie had seemed brilliant 3 weeks ago when Dominic had first started talking about taking a trip to the mountains, and his eyes had gone flat in that particular way that meant he was planning something. The lie had seemed necessary when she discovered what her software was really being used to track. Not packages, people. But here in this cabin that smelled of wood smoke and old books and honest work, surrounded by functional shelves of worn paperbacks and hand-built furniture, the lie felt obscene. She looked around, really looked. There was no art on the walls, no decorations, just shelves made of reclaimed barnwood, holding books with broken spines, diesel engine repair, Wyoming wildlife guides, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus. The floor was scarred wood, uneven but clean. The furniture was old, mismatched, but immaculately maintained. This wasn't a house designed to impress. It was a house built to survive. Her eyes landed on the mantel above the fireplace, a single slab of rough-hewn pine, and on it only one object, a framed photograph. It showed Garrett younger, maybe 35, smiling, actually smiling, the kind of smile that transformed his entire harsh face into something open and alive. His arm was around a woman with bright, laughing eyes and dark curly hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore a field vest covered in pockets, and her hand rested on a piece of geological equipment. Behind them, these same mountains. There was no dust on the frame. This cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was a shrine to a life that had been lost. And this man, this suspicious, hardened, silent man, had brought her into his home without question. He had taken her from the cold, given her warmth, given her coffee, demanded nothing in return. His kindness wasn't a transaction. It was a reflex as basic and powerful as the storm outside. And she had brought a lie into his sanctuary. She who could buy 100 of these cabins and not notice the expense was pretending to have nothing. She was using her fake paralysis as a shield, a story designed to gain sympathy and buy time. Here in the face of true Spartan reality, her life felt cheap, gaudy, wrong. "Thank you," she whispered again. But this time the words weren't for the coffee. Garrett, who was standing by the window staring out at the white void, didn't turn. "For what? For helping me." "Don't thank me." His voice was flat. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for Maggie, and I did it for the dough." He glanced at Kodiak. He doesn't like to see things freeze. He turned then, and his gray eyes met hers. They were empty of warmth, but not unkind, just absent. Like he was looking at a problem to be solved rather than a person. "We're trapped here. Plows won't run this road for 3 days minimum. Maybe a week." He walked over, picked up the second wool blanket, and dropped it on Kodiak. The dog buried his nose under it, but his eyes remained open, amber slits in the firelight still fixed on her. "Get some sleep," Garrett said. "Fire needs feeding every 2 hours. I'll take first watch." He picked up a rifle from beside the door. She hadn't even noticed it, checked the action with a smooth, practiced motion that spoke of thousands of repetitions, and set it back down. Then he sat in an old wooden rocking chair positioned far from the fire and opened a book. Isabel Harmon, Billionaire CEO, sat huddled on the couch, trapped not just by the storm, but by the quiet decency of the hermit and the unsettling, unblinking stare of his dog. The lie had never felt heavier. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded like her younger self, the girl who'd clawed her way out of foster care on grit and code, whispered, "He's going to find out. And when he does, you'll deserve whatever comes next." Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, 3 souls waited, 2 human, 1 canine, each locked in their own private storm. The first full day of the storm was a lesson in silence. The world outside had ceased to exist, replaced by a howling white void that pressed against the windows like something alive and hungry. The wind-driven snow didn't fall. It attacked, scouring the cabin from all sides, piling in drifts that were already swallowing the porch stairs. Inside, the silence was different, thicker, human. Garrett Thorne, unchanged from the day before in his flannel and worn jeans, his beard still flecked with gray, moved through the space like a ghost. He was a man of rigid routine, each action precise and economic. He rose before dawn, though dawn was just a change in the quality of darkness. He fed the fire, his back to her. He shoveled a path to the woodshed, returning with an armload of split pine, his jacket covered in snow that melted instantly in the heat. He made coffee. 1 mug. The scrape of the spoon against ceramic was unnaturally loud. He'd given Belle a bowl of oatmeal. Set it on the small table near the couch along with a bottle of water. Said nothing. She ate her guilt, a bitter flavor beneath the bland sweetness of brown sugar. "How long do you think this will last?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin, desperate to break the oppressive quiet. Garrett paused in his work of checking the window seals, looked over his shoulder. Gray eyes flat and unreadable. "Days." He turned back to his task. The conversation was over. Her world was now confined to the 20-foot space between the fireplace and the kitchen. Her only companions were a man who wouldn't speak and a bund who wouldn't stop staring. Kodiak was always there, never aggressive, never approaching, just present. When Garrett went outside, the dog would lie by the door, a silent guardian, his amber eyes tracking her every small movement, the way she shifted weight on the couch, the tremor in her hands when she reached for the water bottle, the direction of her gaze. When Garrett was inside, Kodiak lay on his rug by the hearth, head up, ears constantly swiveling, processing sounds she couldn't hear. She knew dogs. Her world before all this had included them at the periphery. The pampered golden retrievers of investors. The tiny designer breeds tucked into $1,000 carriers at tech conferences. This was not those dogs. This was an animal that felt less like a pet and more like a 4-legged witness. She tried to bridge the gap that afternoon when Garrett was in the back room, the rhythmic sound of a knife on whetstone grating on her nerves. "Hey, Kodiak," she whispered. The dog's head tilted, his large ears, one scarred, pivoted toward her. "It's quite a storm. I'm glad you and your dad found me." Kodiak simply stared. He did not wag his tail. He did not stand. He offered her nothing but that unrelenting amber assessment. And later, when Garrett prepared their meager dinner, canned beef stew heated on the wood stove, she tried a different approach. Garrett put a bowl down for her, then filled Kodiak's metal dish. The dog sat patiently, not moving toward the food until Garrett gave a low, quiet command she couldn't quite hear. Belle, holding her own bowl, broke off a small piece of the bread Garrett had provided. She held it out toward the dog. "Here, boy." Kodiak looked from her hand to Garrett. "He's not a stray." Garrett's voice came sharp from the shadows by the stove. "He eats from his bowl." Belle's face flushed hot with embarrassment. She retracted her hand, placing the bread back in her stew. "I'm sorry, I just eat." Not unkindly, but as a simple final order. The silence that followed was even heavier. The second night was worse. The storm seemed to gain new furious energy, as if trying to tear the roof from the cabin. The walls groaned. Belle, lying on the couch, couldn't sleep. Her body ached, not from her fabricated paralysis, but from the bone-deep cold that seemed to live in her marrow now, and the tension of maintaining the lie. She was terrified of moving in her sleep, of stretching her legs, of giving herself away. Garrett hadn't slept on the floor as she'd half expected. He'd pulled a military cot from a closet and set it up near the door, his rifle leaning against the wall beside it. He was guarding the exit, or she realized with a chill, guarding her from the exit. It was on the third evening that something shifted. The storm had not abated. The cabin was dim, lit only by the golden pulse of oil lamps and the flickering fire. The generator had been off for hours. Garrett said they needed to conserve fuel. He was at the kitchen table meticulously cleaning his rifle, the parts laid out on an old cloth. The methodical metallic scrape and click of his work was the only sound besides the wind. Belle sat on the couch wrapped in the oatmeal-colored blankets. She'd given up trying to read one of his worn paperbacks. She stared at the window, but there was nothing to see. The glass was a black mirror reflecting the room back at her, a distorted, cozy prison. She saw her own reflection, a pale, tired woman, blonde hair, stringy face scrubbed clean of the armor she usually wore. And she saw the lie. She thought of Dominic. He would have called this place a hovel, would have been pacing furious on his phone demanding helicopter rescue and threatening lawsuits. His anger would have filled the small space until it suffocated everything. Garrett, in contrast, simply existed. He belonged here. He chopped wood. He fed the fire. He maintained his tools. He asked for nothing. He offered her shelter and expected nothing in return. Her lie had felt so clever when she deployed it 3 weeks ago. A tool to escape, to buy time to stay alive when Dominic's eyes had gone cold and he'd suggested this mountain vacation. But here in this cabin, her lie wasn't a tool. It was a violation. This man, this broken, silent hermit, lived by a code she couldn't even begin to understand. His world was built on hard, simple truths. The fire's hot. The storm is dangerous. The dog is loyal. She was the only thing in this cabin that was fake. The realization hit her not as a thought, but as a physical weight settling in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her throat tightened. A single hot tear escaped and slid down her cold cheek. She brushed it away, angry, embarrassed, but it was followed by another. And another. She turned her face away from the room toward the dark, cold glass, pressing her fist to her mouth. She made no sound. It was a desperate, silent collapse, the full weight of her loneliness and guilt and profound self-disgust crashing down. She was crying not for her lost safety, but for the fact that she had become someone she didn't even recognize. A person who had to lie to find a single moment of real kindness. A soft click of claws on floorboards cut through the howl of wind. Across the room, Garrett's hands stilled on his rifle. Belle held her breath, trying to stifle the small sob that threatened to escape. She slowly turned her head. Kodiak was standing, no longer by the hearth. He had left his post. He was looking at her, his head tilted, his gray and tan fur bristling slightly in the firelight. He took a step, then another, moving slowly, not with the suspicion of the past 2 days, but with a quiet, deliberate curiosity. He stopped a few feet from the couch, sniffing the air, his dark, intelligent eyes searching her face. He did not see a paralyzed woman. He did not see a CEO. His canine training had taught him to read stress, fear, pain, and right now he saw only the raw, unadulterated scent of her distress. "Kodiak," she whispered, her voice breaking. The dog took the final 2 steps. He stood beside the couch level with her face. He whined a low, soft sound deep in his chest. Then he nudged his cold, damp nose under her trembling hand, which was clutching the blanket. Belle flinched. A small gasp escaped her. Kodiak nudged her hand again, more insistently. And then, with a long, slow sigh that seemed to release all the tension in the room, he rested his heavy, broad head directly on her knees, right on her lap. His eyes no longer assessing her with suspicion closed. It was a gesture of complete, unconditional surrender. A gesture of comfort. For a long moment, Belle was frozen. Then slowly, tentatively, she lifted her hand and rested it on his head. Her fingers sank into the thick, warm fur. He leaned into the touch, a barely perceptible movement, and sighed again. Across the room, Garrett Scott sat perfectly still. He did not move. He did not breathe. He was staring at his dog, Kodiak, the canine who hadn't offered his trust to a single soul since his handler Chris had died. The dog who was his partner, his shadow, his last line of defense against the world. And that dog had just laid his head in the lap of a stranger offering a comfort Garrett himself had forgotten how to give. Garrett looked from the palm to the woman. And for the first time in 3 days, the hard, suspicious set of his jaw softened. Kodiak had made his decision. The dog's loyalty had shifted, or perhaps expanded in a way Garrett couldn't yet understand. The first crack had appeared in the ice. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted as profoundly as the landscape outside. The storm's violent screaming rage had settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. The snow was no longer falling. It was simply there, a white wall past every window, drifts sculpted into frozen waves that pressed against the glass. When Belle woke on the couch, stiff and cold despite the blankets, the first thing she saw was Kodiak. He was not on his rug by the hearth. He was asleep on the floor next to her, his gray head resting near her feet. When Garrett emerged from his small bedroom, he stopped. His gaze fixed on the dog. He looked at Belle, and for the first time, the suspicion in his eyes was replaced by something else. Deep, profound confusion. The dog's loyalty had shifted. When Belle stirred, the dog's tail thumped twice on the wooden floor. He lifted his head, nudged her hand with his nose, and gave a low, quiet whine. Garrett just watched. He made coffee, his movements just as precise as before, but the rigid set of his shoulders had eased. He brought her a mug. His hand paused as Kodiak pushed his head under Belle's other hand, demanding attention. "He seems to have made a decision," Belle whispered, her voice rough with sleep. "He's a dog," Garrett said curtly, but the words lacked their previous bite. He handed her the coffee. "He doesn't know any better." But he did. Garrett knew that dog. Kodiak was the last living piece of his old life, the last connection to the world before Carolyn died. The dog had been a shell since Chris passed, just as Garrett was after Carolyn. For Kodiak to open up to this stranger, it was either betrayal or miracle, and Garrett didn't know which. The day wore on in this new awkward truce. The snow had stopped, but they were buried. The drifts were easily 6 feet deep against the north-facing windows, casting the cabin in a dim gray light. Garrett spent the morning outside. Belle could hear the rhythmic scrape of a shovel. He was clearing the porch, the path to the woodshed, a small area for Kodiak to relieve himself. She was left alone in the main room, trapped. Garrett had at some point retrieved her broken wheelchair from his truck. It sat in the corner, a useless, mangled piece of technology. She was confined to the couch or to dragging herself to the small bathroom, a humiliating, exhausting process she performed only when Garrett was occupied elsewhere. The cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The living room was on a slightly lower level than the kitchen and the main door. 3 shallow, wide steps. That was the barrier. 3 steps that in her charade were as unscalable as the mountains outside. She wanted to see the sky, wanted to smell the air. The claustrophobia was pressing down on her like a physical weight. Garrett returned, snow-caked in his beard and clinging to his eyelashes. He stamped snow off his boots and shed his heavy jacket. He didn't look at her, but he saw her staring at the 3 steps, her gaze fixed on the front door as if it were a portal to another universe. He saw the helplessness. And for the first time, he didn't see it as a burden. He saw it as a problem to be solved. He walked past her into the kitchen, poured himself coffee, stood there for a long minute just staring at those 3 steps. Belle watched him. He looked at the steps, then at the wheelchair, then at the steps again. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Then, without a word, he set his mug down, walked to a large storage closet, pulled out a measuring tape. He went to the steps, measured their height, measured their width, wrote numbers on a scrap of wood with a carpenter's pencil. He went to the front door, opened it, and disappeared into the blizzard-white world. Belle listened. She heard the door to his workshop, a separate, smaller building attached to the woodshed, creak open. Then silence. Minutes later, the sharp, rhythmic rasp of a handsaw cutting lumber broke the quiet. Belle's heart seemed to stop. She knew exactly what that sound was. She had overseen construction of data centers, had watched contractors build server rooms from bare concrete. She knew the sound of work. The sawing continued for an hour. Steady, determined, a meditation against the backdrop of wind. It was joined by the sound of a drill. Then the careful, muffled thud of a hammer, as if he was purposefully striking the blows softly. She sat on the couch, her hands clasped, the lie a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. He was a man of action. He hadn't asked what she needed. He had seen it. The simplicity of it, the quiet, practical kindness was more profound than any grand gesture she had ever received. Dominic would have called a concierge service, would have had someone else handle it, would have made sure she knew how much it cost him. Garrett was building. 2 hours later, he returned. His face was flushed with cold, his beard dusted with sawdust. He was carrying a long, simple ramp made of raw plywood and 2x4s. It was heavy, but he handled it easily. He didn't speak. He maneuvered it through the door and into the living room. It fit perfectly over the 3 steps, creating a solid, gentle incline from her level to the front door. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It'll hold," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's not pretty." "Garrett," she started, her voice thick. "The porch is cleared." He interrupted. He walked over to her broken wheelchair, inspected the bent wheel, then with a grunt of effort used his bare hands to bend the metal frame back into a shape that was at least somewhat functional. The wheel wobbled, but it would roll. He pushed the chair in front of her. "Let's go." It took a minute, a clumsy transfer from couch to chair, but he helped. His hands were strong and sure on her arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He pushed the chair up the new ramp. The wood groaned slightly, but held just as he'd said. He navigated her through the doorway and onto the covered porch. The air hit her first. So cold it felt like a physical slap, but it was clean, sharp, alive. It smelled of pine and ozone and frozen earth. The world was a blinding sculpted white, snow piled in drifts that looked like frozen waves. The trees were buried to their lower branches. The sky was pale, bruised gray. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Garrett stood beside her, not touching her, not speaking, just sharing the space. Kodiak had followed them, sitting at Garrett's side, his warm breath pluming in the air. "You didn't have to do that," Belle said finally, her voice quiet. "I had to do something." He looked out at the woods. "Can't just sit. Not good for anyone to just sit." "No one has ever done something like that for me." He finally looked at her. His gray eyes were clear, the confusion gone. "Done what? Built a ramp? It's just wood. Practical." "It was kind," she whispered. He frowned, uncomfortable with the word. He leaned against the railing, crossed his arms. "Storm's breaking. We'll be dug out in a few days." They stood in the cold, clean silence for a long time. The only sound was the wind, now a gentle whisper, and the soft drip of snow melting from the eaves. "Why do you live out here?" she asked. "All alone." Garrett didn't answer for a full minute. He watched a Clark's nutcracker land on a snow-covered branch. "I'm not alone." He nodded toward Kodiak. "You know what I mean." He sighed. The sound was heavy, full of a weariness that went beyond the storm. "I live here because it's the only place that makes sense. The world out there," he gestured vaguely, "it's too loud, too fast. People don't listen." He paused, then continued, his voice softer. "My wife, Carolyn, she loved this mountain. She was a geologist, understood quiet things. Rocks, time, layers of earth that took millions of years to form." He touched the rough-hewn log supporting the porch roof. "We built this place together after my last tour. It was supposed to be our fortress, our quiet place." He fell silent. Belle waited. She passed, 4 years ago, 2021. "The quiet is different now, but it's all I have left of her." He looked at Belle, his eyes raw in a way that made her want to look away, but she couldn't. "I'm not hiding out here, Miss—" He paused, realizing he didn't know her last name. "Harmon, Belle Harmon." "Miss Harmon, I'm not hiding, I'm just trying to hold on to the quiet." He tapped the log again. "This is all that's left." Belle looked at the strong, simple ramp he had built. It wasn't just wood, it was an answer. He was a man who fixed what was broken because that was the only thing he knew how to do anymore. "Carolyn," Belle said softly, testing the name. "She must have been very special." "She was." Garrett turned his face back to the mountains. "She was practical. Would have built that ramp in half the time." A small, genuine smile touched his lips. It was the first time Belle had seen it. It transformed his harsh, weathered face, revealing the man who had existed before the grief, before the quiet, before the walls. And in that moment, Belle's lie felt like a betrayal of something sacred. This man had opened a door she didn't deserve to walk through, and she had walked through it wearing a mask. The conversation on the porch had changed things. The fortress of Garrett's silence had been breached not by Belle, but by his own admission of grief. He had spoken of Carolyn, he had shared his wound, and now the cabin felt charged with a new fragile intimacy. That night, the storm returned for a final violent encore. The wind howled, rattling the shutters Garrett had secured. In the main room, the sleeping arrangements remained the same, but the occupants had shifted. Garrett was on his cot by the door, his back to the room. Belle was on the couch, but Kodiak was not on his rug by the hearth. He had of his own volition chosen a new spot, the floor beside the couch, a gray protective shadow near the woman who had for 3 days shown him nothing but quiet, broken honesty, even if she didn't know she was showing it. For Garrett Thorne, sleep was not refuge. It was a shallow, vigilant state, a habit burned into his psyche by years of SEAL training. He did not rest. He waited. It was long after midnight, in the deep, breathless quiet between gusts of wind, that a sound pulled him from the surface. It was not the storm, not the house settling. It was a soft scraping, a footstep. No, a soft, clean click. The sound of glass being placed on the kitchen counter. Garrett was awake instantly, his body rigid, senses screaming. The cot creaked as he shifted his hand, moving in the dark, bypassing the rifle, and finding the heavy metal flashlight on the floor. An animal, he thought. Raccoon. Martin. Something that found a way in. He rose without sound, his bare feet making no purchase on the cold wooden floor. He moved past the couch. In the faint dying glow of fireplace embers, he saw the mound of blankets. But they were in a heap. She was not on the couch. His heart hammered against his ribs. He thumbed the switch on the flashlight. A bright white beam cut through the darkness, flooding the kitchen. Empty. He swung the beam toward the main window, the one that looked out over the deep, snow-filled ravine, and the light found her. She was standing, not leaning, not struggling, standing perfectly, almost casually. Her back to him, both feet planted firmly on the floor. She wore the simple cotton shirt and pants he'd given her, clothes that had belonged to Carolyn. One hand braced lightly on the window frame. The other was stretching her arm, reaching above her head as she worked a knot out of her shoulder. A picture of domestic normalcy. The beam of the flashlight froze on her. Garrett's world tilted. The air left his lungs, stolen by a sudden icy vacuum. The ramp. The word echoed in his mind like an accusation. The ramp. His hands calloused and rough, aching from the cold as he sawed the plywood. His knees protesting as he knelt to secure the boards. The image of him bending her broken wheelchair wheel back into place. He had talked about Carolyn. He had stood on the porch, his chest torn open, and he had talked about his wife to this woman. This liar. He felt hot, acidic shame crawl up his throat, so powerful it made him dizzy. He had been played for a fool. His grief, his home, his memories, all of it had been used as a stage for her performance. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. He was a statue, his arm locked, holding the beam of light steady on her. The hermit, the man trained for any threat, was completely disarmed by the sheer audacious depth of the betrayal. In the circle of light, Belle didn't seem to realize she'd been caught. She was lost in the moment, mesmerized by the storm visible through the window. She had been a prisoner for days, a prisoner of the cabin, of her wheelchair, of her own lie. The claustrophobia had become unbearable. After she was sure Garrett was asleep, she had stood, just to feel the blood in her legs, just to feel real. The sudden bright light on her back was a physical blow. She froze, turned slowly. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widened and terrified. A perfect mirror of the woman he'd found in the Aspen cabin. But this time the terror was real. "Garrett," she breathed. He did not answer. The silence in the cabin was absolute, a heavy, crushing weight. Just the sound of wind, the tremor of the flashlight in his hand, and the two of them locked in the spotlight of the lie. And then a new sound entered the scene, a soft woof. Kodiak, asleep at the foot of the couch, lifted his head. He blinked, confused by the light and the tension. He stood up, stretched his long body, and let out a small, sleepy yawn. He looked at Garrett, a dark statue by the door holding the light. Then he looked at Belle, standing in the kitchen. His dog brain processed the scene. There was Belle. She was standing. In his mind, this was not betrayal. This was not a lie. This was wonderful. The sad, quiet woman who sat all the time, the woman who gave good scratches and cried softly and smelled of sadness, was now up. She was standing, just like Garrett. This was good. This was play. A low, excited rumble started in his chest. His tail, long and bushy, began to move. A single hesitant wag. "Garrett, please." Bell's voice shook. "Let me explain." Garrett's face was a mask of cold fury. His silence was her only answer. Kodiak, hearing the sudden energy in Bell's voice, took it as confirmation. His tail went from a wag to a blur, a heavy thump, thump, thump against the side of the sofa. He trotted forward, his claws clicking on the floor, and pushed his head against Bell's leg. He looked up at her, his mouth open in a happy pant, and then back at Garrett. "Look, she's up. She's playing." And then he let out a single bright, playful bark. The sound was obscene. It was the sound of pure, simple joy, and it detonated in the deadly silence of Garrett's betrayal. His dog, his loyal partner, the animal that had been his only truth for 2 years since adopting him, his Kodiak, was wagging his tail at the lie. "Kodiak, no." Belle whispered, her hands shaking as she tried to push his head away. The dog, confused, thought she was playing. He dodged her hand and barked again. A short, sharp invitation. "Play with me." Garrett Thorne stood in the darkness. He watched his dog celebrate the woman who had just ripped his fragile trust to shreds. He watched Belle, her face pale, her lie exposed. He did not speak. He did not yell. With a slow, deliberate movement, he lowered the flashlight. The beam dropped from her face to the floor. Then, with a final sharp click, he turned the light off. The cabin was plunged back into total darkness, save for the faint red glow of dying embers. The only sound was the wind and the confused, happy panting of the dog who had just illuminated the truth. Dawn arrived not as a sunrise, but as a change in the quality of darkness. The world outside the cabin windows slowly shifted from howling, kinetic black to still, bruised gray. The storm, having exhausted its fury, was over, and in the silence the betrayal was deafening. Garrett had been up since before the light, his movements rigid, precise. He did not look at Belle. He did not speak. The man who just yesterday had shared a vulnerable piece of his past was gone, erased. In his place was the seal, a cold, efficient machine. He fed the fire. He made coffee. One mug. He fed Kodiak. His actions were economical, stripped of any excess humanity. Belle sat on the edge of the couch, her feet planted firmly on the floor. The lie was over. There was no point in pretending anymore. She was dressed in the clothes he had given her, Carolyn's clothes, and the shame of it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Kodiak was a knot of confused energy. He whined a low, anxious sound and moved between them like a child caught between arguing parents. He would nudge Garrett's hand, be ignored, and then trot over to Belle, resting his head on her knee, looking for the comfort he'd found the night before. But the air was too thick with human misery. Even the dog could feel it. "Garrett," Belle began, her voice a dry croak. "Please, I need to explain." "Don't." The word was flat, devoid of anger, devoid of anything but a complete, chilling emptiness. It was the sound of a door being locked from the inside. He pulled on his heavy boots, grabbed the shovel, and went outside. Belle watched through the window as he began to dig, not just clearing a path. He was attacking the snow with contained, furious energy, each shovelful thrown with barely restrained violence. She saw him reach the porch. His back stiffened. He found the ramp he had built for her, with his own hands in the freezing cold. He kicked it. The dull thud echoed across the snow. Then he picked it up, carried it 10 yards from the cabin, and threw it into a drift. A useless, ugly piece of wood. A monument to his mistake. Belle closed her eyes. A fresh wave of self-loathing washed over her. That was when the new sound began. It was not the wind, not a sound of the woods. It was a deep, rhythmic, artificial thunder that seemed to come from the sky itself. A heavy, percussive thump, thump, thump that rattled the dishes in the kitchen cabinet. Garrett froze mid-shovel, his body instantly shifting into a defensive stance. He scanned the gray sky. Kodiak beside him erupted, not barking at a threat on the ground, barking at the sky. A series of deep, challenging roars. Belle ran to the window, her heart seizing. Not with fear, with dread. She knew that sound. A sleek black machine, a Bell 429 helicopter, broke through the low-hanging clouds. It circled the cabin once like a predator, assessing territory, its searchlight cutting a sterile white cone across the snow. Then, with terrifying precision, it descended its rotor wash, blasting the new snow into a blinding vortex. It settled onto the wide, flat clearing Garrett used as a yard, its blades slowly winding down. Garrett had not moved. He stood, shovel in hand, a gray shepherd at his side, facing the high-tech intrusion with the stillness of a man who had been in worse situations and survived. The side door slid open. A man in a dark, functional flight suit hopped out. Cole Ramirez, the pilot. He stood at attention by the machine, mirrored aviator sunglasses hiding his eyes. Then the passenger emerged. He stepped out of the helicopter and onto the snow, as if stepping from a limousine onto a red carpet. This was Dominic Creed. He was everything Garrett was not. Where Garrett was weathered, Dominic was polished. Mid-40s tall, with the kind of build that came from expensive personal trainers rather than hard work. He wore a dark navy cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than Garrett's truck. The collar turned up against cold he wouldn't feel for more than 30 seconds. His black leather shoes, completely impractical for the terrain, looked spotless. His dark hair was perfectly styled, untouched by storm or wind. He radiated an aura of effortless, expensive control. He looked at the cabin. His upper lip curled slightly. Distaste. He looked at Garrett. His eyes slid over him as if he were a piece of uninteresting rustic furniture. Then he saw Belle, who had, without thinking, stepped onto the porch. She was standing next to where Garrett had been, her feet bare on the frozen wood. "Well," Dominic said, his voice carrying easily in the cold, still air. It was smooth-cultured, dripping with condescension. "The sleeping beauty awakens. And look, a miracle. She stands." "Dominic," Belle breathed, her voice shaking. How did you find me?" Dominic gave a short, indulgent laugh, the kind you'd give to a child asking a foolish question. "Belle, darling, please. Did you really think the emergency satellite phone I gave you was just for emergencies?" He tapped the side of his head. "GPS chip. First thing my security team installed. I'm disappointed, really. I thought the game would last longer." He finally properly looked at Garrett, scanned him from worn boots to flannel shirt to the beard still dusted with snow. "So," Dominic said, addressing Belle, but looking at Garrett, "this is the local color you've adopted, the noble hermit. I suppose I should thank him for keeping you warm." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Did you tell him your name, or were you Jane Doe for the full frontier experience?" Garrett said nothing. His hand was tight on the shovel handle. He was a statue carved from ice and rage. "The farce is over, Belle." Dominic's voice hardened, the playful mockery gone. He was bored now. This was business. "Cole is here. We're leaving. We have the Anderson Gala Friday, and you've made me look like a fool. Get your things." He took a step toward the porch, his confidence absolute. He was a man who had never been told no, who had never encountered a problem money couldn't solve. He reached for Belle's arm, his expression one of annoyance, as if grabbing a recalcitrant pet. "Now, Belle, enough of this?" He never touched her. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the snow, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate in the air itself. Kodiak, who had been standing silently at Garrett's side, had moved. He was now at the bottom of the porch steps, perfectly positioned between Dominic and Belle. His hackles stood on end, making him look twice as large. His gray and tan fur bristled. His lips curled back slightly, revealing a white flash of teeth. The sound that came from him was no longer a confused whine. It was a deep, resonant, and utterly serious warning growl. The growl of a police K-9 who had decided someone was a threat. Dominic Creed, a man who controlled boardrooms and moved millions with a phone call, flinched. He physically recoiled, taking a full step back. His polished facade cracked, revealing the coward beneath. "Garrett," Belle said, her voice sharp with panic. But Dominic, assuming the dog belonged to the mountain man, snarled, "Call off your animal, you!" Garrett didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Dominic turned back to Belle, his face ugly with anger, now the mask slipping. "Belle, I am not playing. Get on the helicopter, or I swear to God—" Kodiak took one more step forward. The growl became a hard, sharp snap in the air, his teeth clicking together inches from Dominic's expensive coat. And in that moment, something inside Belle shifted. She looked at Dominic, a man who saw her as an accessory, a useful tool. A man who had just admitted to tracking her like property, like one of the shipments in her software. She looked at Garrett, a man she had deeply betrayed, who was now standing silent and steady, not on Dominic's side, but not on hers either. Just watching, waiting. And she looked at Kodiak, the animal she had lied to, the pug who, in her moment of deepest shame, had laid his head on her lap. The animal who was now, without hesitation, without command, willing to put himself between her and danger. She had been searching for something real in her gilded hollow life. And here it was, in the form of a silent hermit and a loyal dog. "No," Belle said. Dominic stopped. "What did you say?" She stood up taller, planting her bare feet on the icy wood. She looked him directly in the eye. Her voice was clear, sharp, ringing in the cold mountain air. "No, I'm not going." Dominic's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Shock, disbelief, rage. "You're choosing this." He gestured at Garrett at the cabin. You're choosing poverty and isolation over everything I've given you. You haven't given me anything. Belle said, her voice steady now. You've used me, my company, my software, to track people like cargo. Dominic's eyes narrowed. You have no proof of that. I have server logs, encrypted messages, financial records. Belle's voice was ice. I've had them for 3 weeks, and the moment I leave this mountain, they're going to the FBI. The silence that followed was absolute. Dominic's face went pale, then red. You wouldn't dare. Try me. For a long moment, Dominic stood there, his expensive coat flapping in the rotor wash, his carefully constructed world crumbling. Then he turned on his heel. You'll regret this, Belle, I promise you that. He climbed back into the helicopter, slammed the door, the rotors spun up, the machine lifted, buffeting snow in all directions. And then it was gone, swallowed by the gray Wyoming sky. The rhythmic thunder faded, then disappeared entirely. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, colder than the snow, heavier than the storm. On the porch, no one moved. Belle stood, her bare feet aching, the frozen wood biting into her skin. She didn't notice. Her entire being was focused on the man beside her, Garrett. Thorne had not moved a muscle. He was still standing in the same spot, hand gripping the shovel handle. He was not looking at the sky where the helicopter had vanished. He was looking at the ground, at the pristine, untouched snow. Kodiak was a knot of vibrating confusion. The adrenaline from the confrontation had not faded. He stood between them, his hackles still half raised, and let out a low, anxious whine. He looked up at Garrett, expecting a command, a word of praise, something. Garrett said nothing. With a slow, deliberate motion, Garrett turned. He walked past Belle, his boots thudding heavily on the porch steps he had cleared. He did not go inside. He went back to the yard. He lifted the shovel and, with a grunt of physical exertion, plunged it into the deep-packed snow near the cabin's foundation. He was digging, not to clear a path, just digging. The rhythmic scrape and hiss of the shovel was the only sound. Scrape, hiss, throw. He was building a wall of silence. Belle's breath hitched. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. She stumbled back inside the cabin, collapsing onto the wooden bench by the door, her hands shaking so violently she clasped them together. The cabin felt different. The cozy, warm sanctuary had become a cold, sterile box. Kodiak followed her in his claws, clicking anxiously on the floor. He nudged her hand, looking for reassurance. When she didn't respond, he padded to the center of the room and lay down, head on his paws, his dark eyes tracking the door, waiting for his master to make sense of the world again. After 10 long minutes, Garrett returned. He did not slam the door. He closed it with a soft, final click. He did not look at her. He walked past her, past the couch, past the fireplace. He was treating her as if she did not exist. He went to the kitchen and ran the tap. The sound of water drumming into the iron sink was unnaturally loud. He washed his hands, scrubbing them with a ferocity that was frightening, as if he could scrub away the memory of building the ramp, of helping her. Garrett, she whispered. He turned off the tap. The sound vanished. I'm so sorry, she choked out, standing. I never meant. He turned around slowly. His face was a mask. The warmth she had seen on the porch yesterday, the man who had spoken of Carolyn, was gone. The seal was back. His gray eyes were flat, cold, looked straight through her. Sorry for what? He asked, his voice a low, empty rasp. For lying? Or for getting caught? No, it wasn't like that. I was trying to escape him. The money, the world I was in, it's a koyakin. I just needed to know if anyone could see me, the real me, not, I don't care about your money. He said it so quietly it was more brutal than any shout. He walked past her into the center of the room. He looked around, his gaze falling on the window where he'd caught her standing. His jaw tightened. I don't care that you're rich, he said, his voice dangerously low. I care that you lied. He faced her. I let you into my home. This house, his voice cracked slightly. This is all I have left of her. This house is built on truth. It was the only place left that was real. He was not angry. That was the terrifying part. He was not yelling. He was dissecting. He was a surgeon cutting away infection. And she was the infection. I built a ramp for you, he said, his voice flat, stating a fact. My hands ached from the cold. I wasted lumber on it. Garrett, please. I talked to you, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken on that porch. I said her name. I talked about Carolyn. He winced, a flicker of profound pain crossing his face. I haven't said her name to another person since the funeral. Not in 4 years. Belle was crying now, silent tears of shame. It wasn't a joke. I was desperate. And what about him? Garrett's voice finally cracked, not with sadness, but with sudden hot fury. He pointed at the dog. Kodiak, hearing the tension, had risen to his feet. He trusted you, Garrett snapped. He laid his head in your lap. He chose you. His voice broke, but he recovered it instantly, turning the break into a blade. His trust is the only clean, honest thing I've had in my life since she died. He stepped closer, his gaze pinning her. His trust is real. And you took that. You used it. He looked at the ma and his voice broke again, but he forced it steady. He barked. He thought you were playing. He wagged his tail at your lie. You turned my dog into a joke. This was it, the core of the betrayal. It wasn't the house or the wood or even the memory of Carolyn. It was the dome. It was the corruption of the one pure thing he had left. I lost Carolyn, he said, his voice dropping back into that Arctic void. This place, this quiet was all I had to hold on to. Trust was the only thing I had left to give. And you turned it into a game. See if the hermit and his dog are stupid enough to fall for it. He shook his head, a small, disgusted motion. Well, congratulations. We were. He turned his back on her. The confrontation was over. The verdict was in. He picked up a log and moved toward the fireplace. What do you want me to do? She whispered, her body trembling. Do you want me to leave? I can call him back. Garrett's back was to her. He knelt by the fire, opening the iron grate. The rush of air made the embers glow. I don't want anything from you, he said, his voice muffled, distant. The helicopter is gone. The roads are still blocked. You're trapped here. He placed the log in the fire. Just stay on your side of the room and don't talk to the dog. It was not forgiveness. It was not a reprieve. It was a sentence. He was not kicking her out. That would have been too easy, too clean. He was instead erasing her. He stood, dusted his hands off, and walked to his cot. He picked up the book he'd been reading days before. He sat down and opened it. The coldness was absolute. His refusal to engage, his dismissal of her as a human being, worthy of even anger, was far more brutal than anything Dominic could have done. Belle sank onto the couch. She was no longer a person. She was a ghost trapped in a house with a man who could no longer see her. She looked at Kodiak. The dog whined, caught in no man's land between two hostile forces. He looked at Garrett, but his master's face was hidden by the book. He looked at Belle, but she was broken. He padded back to his rug by the hearth, lay down, and placed his head on his paws. The bridge of trust was gone. Belle Collins sat in the heavy, suffocating silence. She finally understood. She had broken the one thing in this entire harsh, beautiful landscape that money could not buy and apologies could not fix. She had broken trust. The night was long and cold. Belle didn't sleep. She sat on the couch wrapped in wool blankets, listening to the cabin settle and creak around her. Every rustle of fire, every groan of wood seemed to amplify the crushing weight of Garrett's silence. He hadn't moved from his cot by the door. She knew he wasn't sleeping. She could feel his quiet vigilance, a palpable wall of unforgiveness. Kodiak too seemed to sense the shift. He lay on his rug by the hearth heads on pause, but his eyes were open, tracking her in the dim light. He would whine occasionally, a soft questioning sound, looking from Belle to Garrett, as if begging them to make sense of the terrible chasm between them. But neither spoke. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered world in hues of bruised violet and cold pink, Belle knew what she had to do. Staying was pointless. It was prolonged agony for everyone, especially for Garrett, who now saw her as nothing more than a living embodiment of betrayal. She had her phone, the satellite phone Dominic had given her, the one with the GPS chip. She had kept it hidden, a last link to her old life, a desperate tether she hadn't been ready to cut. Now it was her only way out. She waited, heard the distinct sounds of Garrett preparing to go outside, the scrape of his shovel. Today she heard the more purposeful thud of his heavy boots, the creak of the door to his woodshed. He was leaving, going into the forest as he usually did when he needed distance. Today, she was the world he was distancing himself from. She heard the crunch of his boots on packed snow growing fainter, the gentle thud of the woodshed door closing. He was gone. The cabin was silent, just her and Kodiak. The dog watched her, his ears slightly lowered. Belle slowly, carefully slid her hand under the couch cushion, retrieving the sleek, dark satellite phone. The cold, smooth plastic felt alien in her hand compared to the rough wool blankets and worn wood of the cabin. She powered it on. The screen glowed a sterile blue light in the dim room. She had reception. Her fingers trembled as she navigated to her contacts. She knew the number by heart. Simon Clark, her personal driver and head of security. A man of quiet competence who asked no questions and executed every instruction with military precision. Former Special Forces, now in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed. She typed the message, short, Direct. No emotion. Simon. Location GPS coordinates auto-filled. Require immediate extraction. Private chopper or ground vehicle, whichever is fastest. Ensure discretion. Do not involve Dominic Creed. She pressed send. The small sent confirmation flashed on the screen. It would take hours. Perhaps the better part of the day for Simon to arrange it. The nearest private airstrip was in Lander. A ground vehicle would take even longer to navigate the newly cleared but still treacherous roads. She had time to leave a piece of herself behind. She found an old piece of paper on Garrett's kitchen table, a discarded shopping list half scribbled. She found a pen, its ink barely flowing, and she began to write. She didn't write an apology. Garrett wouldn't accept it. She didn't write an explanation of her wealth or her gilded cage. He wouldn't care. She wrote a confession. She wrote about the emptiness that had driven her to desperate lengths, the superficiality of her life, the transactional nature of every relationship, especially with Dominic. She wrote about how his love was a calculation, how he'd used her software company to track human cargo across borders, how she discovered it 3 weeks ago and realized she was complicit. She wrote about the profound loneliness that had led her to create the lie to test if anyone would see her. Not her money, not her status, just her. She wrote about finding Garrett, about the jarring reality of his existence, the simple raw honesty of his cabin, the way he moved, the way he worked, the way he guarded his pain like a precious, fragile thing. She wrote about Carolyn, about the story he'd shared on the porch, the way his face had softened when he spoke her name, the courage it must have taken to open that wound. And then she wrote about Kodiak. She described the gray dog's watchful eyes, his initial suspicion, his eventual unconditional trust. She described the way he had laid his head on her lap, a silent, profound act of grace. She described the joy in his bark when he saw her stand, the pure, innocent celebration that had paradoxically torn Garrett's heart apart. He taught me what real trust looks like. She wrote her handwriting barely legible through tears. He knew my pain, not my status. He saw me the broken person, not the fake victim. And I betrayed him. And by betraying him, I betrayed you. I didn't give you anything with the money. I took something away from them. The bank was going to take Carolyn's legacy. I couldn't let that happen. You don't owe me anything. The debt is gone. I came back to make things right, but I understand if you can't forgive me. Thank you for showing me what real kindness looks like. She finished the letter, her hand aching. She folded it carefully, placing it on the kitchen table, weighted down by a small, smooth river stone she found on the windowsill. Then she looked around. There was one more thing. She remembered Garrett's catalog, a worn, mud-splattered thing from an outdoor supply store. She remembered seeing Kodiak once staring at a page. It was filled with dog toys. One in particular, a bright red, nearly indestructible rubber ball designed for large, powerful chewers. Kodiak had looked at it with silent longing, a rare flash of pure, uncomplicated desire in his usually stoic eyes. She had made a mental note then, an idle thought. Now it was a mission. She pulled out her phone again. Another quick, discreet message to Simon. Please procure one large, indestructible, red rubber dog ball. Best quality for German Shepherd. Deliver with pickup vehicle. It was a small thing, ridiculously small given the circumstances, but it was a silent, sincere apology to the only creature in this cabin who had offered her unconditional acceptance. It was a tangible piece of her gratitude and her remorse. She looked at Kodiak. I'm sorry, boy, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry. He whined softly, a sound of shared sorrow. Belle sat down on the couch again, her body empty, her mind numb. She just waited. For Simon. For the final, irrevocable end of this strange, painful, utterly real chapter of her life. For the moment she would leave the quiet, the man and the dog she had broken. 3 weeks later, the world had returned to its original state of silence. The roads were plowed, the sky was a high, brilliant blue. The snow had formed a deep, glittering crust over the land. Garrett Thorne and Kodiak were once again alone. But the silence was no longer peaceful, it was hollow. Garrett had returned from the woods the day she left, his footsteps heavy, his mind braced. He'd found the cabin empty, the air cold, the fire almost dead. He had seen the letter on the kitchen table. He had read it once, then he'd folded it, placed it in the small metal box where he kept Carolyn's letters, and locked it. He had not read it again. He had also found the ball. It was sitting on the rug by the hearth, bright, obnoxious, synthetic red, looking garish and alien against the rustic wood and stone of the cabin. It was as she had ordered, large, heavy, seemingly indestructible. He had looked at it, his jaw tight. A toy. A token. Then Kodiak had seen it. The dog approached, sniffed, and nudged it with his nose. The ball rolled. Kodiak's ears, which had been drooping for days, suddenly perked. He pounced. For 3 weeks, that red ball had been the third presence in the cabin. It was the first thing Kodiak looked for in the morning, and the last thing he nudged slobber-covered into Garrett's hand at night. The sound of it, a heavy thump on wooden floor, a soft whump as the dog caught it, had become the new rhythm of the house. Garrett hated it. He hated it because it was a reminder. He hated it because it was a bribe. And in his darkest, most honest moments, he hated it because his dog had accepted it. Kodiak, who had been his stoic partner in grief, was now once again just a dog, finding simple, uncomplicated joy in a gift from the woman who had shattered their world. Every time Kodiak dropped the ball at his feet, tail wagging, eyes bright, Garrett felt a fresh sting of betrayal. He would ignore the offering, turn his back, wait for the dog to give up. But Kodiak never gave up. He just waited, his tail slowing, and nudged the ball against Garrett's hand. A silent, persistent question. Today was supply day, the first since she had left. The drive into town was tense. The roads were clear, but the air in the truck was thick. Kodiak, who usually sat in the passenger seat head high, was in the back, curled up, the red ball tucked between his paws. The small town of Pinedale was waking from its frozen slumber. Garrett parked, pulled his collar tight. He went to the post office, the same small brick building he visited once a month. He unlocked his P.O. box. Inside was the usual pile: junk mail, a new supply catalog, and one thick formal envelope. It was from Wyoming Regional Bank. Cold dread, sharp and familiar, settled in his stomach. He was late. Always late. He'd been shuffling payments, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul ever since Carolyn's medical bills had wiped them out. He knew what this was: a warning. The next step toward foreclosure. He shoved the mail into his jacket pocket, bought his supplies: coffee, flour, dog food. His movements clipped. His answers to the checkout clerk, low monosyllables. He drove home. Back in the cabin, he set groceries on the counter. The air was cold. He needed to rebuild the fire. Kodiak, sensing his dark mood, stayed on his rug, the red ball held loosely in his mouth. Garrett sat at the kitchen table, stared at the envelope. Might as well get it over with. He ripped it open. It wasn't a warning, it was a single sheet of thick cream-colored paper. He read the dense legal language, his mind struggling to catch up. Pleased to inform you that the outstanding mortgage on property 14 Delta Sierra has been satisfied in full. A zero balance statement is attached for your records. We thank you for your business. He read it again. A third time. It was a mistake. Had to be. He scanned the document for a name or reason, found it at the bottom, in a crisp, clear digital signature. Sincerely, Isabel Grant, Vice President, Loan Servicing. And just above that, in the payment details section, Payer of Record, True Root Holdings, LLC. The room went very, very quiet. The blood drained from Garrett's face, then rushed back. A hot, prickling tide of pure, unadulterated rage. He shot to his feet. The chair scraped back with a harsh tearing sound that made Kodiak flinch. Paid. The word was a violation. He slammed his fist on the table. The coffee mug jumped. No, she had bought him. She had taken his silence, his pain, his pride, and put a price tag on it. She had walked away and, as a final arrogant gesture, thrown her money at his problems. She had reduced him to a charity case. A project. A stray she could feel good about rescuing with her checkbook. All his life as a SEAL, as a man, he had lived by a code. You stand on your own. You do not take what you have not earned. His pride was all he had left. And she had just taken that too. He was pacing the cabin, hands clenched, breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He wanted to hit something, wanted to burn the letter. He stopped in front of the fireplace, looked at the photo of Carolyn, her bright, laughing eyes. I'm losing it, Kate, he thought. The anger so sharp it felt like grief. I'm losing your home. The thought stopped him cold. I'm losing your home. He had been. It wasn't abstract fear, it was mathematical fact. Slowly, his rage still simmering, he walked to the old battered file cabinet in the corner, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out the thick folder marked Home. He dumped the contents on the table, a cascade of red-stamped envelopes, past due notices, complex interest statements. He found the original loan document from 2018, looked at the principal. The number was astronomical, a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. He looked at the interest-only payments he was barely making. The balloon payment that was looming, the one that would have, without question, destroyed him. He saw the letters from the bank, the ones he'd ignored, the ones where Isabel Grant's name was printed above threats of legal action. He was not losing this place. He had already lost it. He was just too proud to admit it. He sank into the chair, the anger draining, replaced by hollow, profound emptiness. He looked at the official letter again. Paid in full. He thought of her letter, the one in the box, the confession. I didn't give you anything. I took something away from them. She hadn't paid him for his silence. She hadn't bought him off. She, a woman trapped in a cage of money, had seen his cage. The one built of debt. The chain that tied him to this land, a chain the bank was about to pull tight. This wasn't an act of power, it was an act of liberation. She wasn't paying him off. She was protecting him, protecting Carolyn's legacy, giving him the one thing she had in abundance so he could keep the one thing he had left. She was not buying him. She was setting him free. The understanding settled over him. Heavy, complex. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't gratitude. It was just a fact, as solid and real as the ramp he'd built. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from Maggie Sutherland. Heard you had quite the storm up there. Young couple ever show up at Aspen? He stared at the message for a long moment, then typed slowly, deliberately. Just one. She's fine now. 3 dots appeared. Then, good. That's good, Garrett. You did right by her. Carolyn would be proud. He set the phone down, throat tight. Maggie didn't know the half of it, but she was right about one thing. He had done right. In the end, a soft, wet whump interrupted his thoughts. He looked down. Kodiak was at his feet. The dog had crept back head low and gently placed the bright red ball on top of Garrett's boot. Garrett stared at the ball, the garish, ugly, indestructible symbol of her. He reached down, his hand trembling slightly. He picked it up. It was heavy, solid. Kodiak let out a low, hopeful whine. His tail thumped once on the floor. Garrett looked at his dog, then at the bank letter. Then he pulled out his phone again. He opened the browser, typed Dominic Creed arrest. The headlines loaded slowly. Tech CEO arrested in human trafficking sting. True Route software evidence key to conviction. Federal grand jury indicts Dominic Creed on 47 counts. Whistleblower Belle Harmon testifies, I had to stop him. Garrett's breath caught. She hadn't just run, she'd fought. The articles detailed it all. Belle had gone to the FBI the day after the helicopter left, handed over server logs, encrypted messages, financial records. Her software had been used to track 9 women across state lines to a trafficking hub in Calgary. The evidence was ironclad. Dominic was facing life without parole, and Belle had made sure of it. Garrett set the phone down, looked at the bank letter, then at the red ball in his hand. She hadn't bought his silence. She'd bought him time. Time to heal. Time to decide what came next. While she was out there burning down her old life to save people she'd never met. He had been set free. He wasn't sure what to do with that, but for the first time in 3 weeks, he looked at the red ball and he didn't feel anger. He felt the weight of it in his hand, the realness of it. He looked at Kodiak, and he threw the ball. It bounced off the far wall with a solid thunk. Kodiak exploded into motion, all joy and purpose, his claws scrabbling on the wood as he chased it down. The dog brought it back, tail wagging so hard his entire back end moved, dropped it at Garrett's feet, looked up with those amber eyes. Again, Garrett picked up the ball and threw it again. Spring had come to Wyoming not as gentle arrival, but as violent, messy thaw. The world, which had been locked in silent white rigor, was now weeping. The sound of dripping water was constant, a pervasive liquid ticking from cabin eaves, pine branches, granite boulders. The snow was receding, pulling back like a dirty blanket, revealing land that was scarred, brown, muddy, but alive. Garrett Thorne was alive too, though he would not have used that word. He was functioning, moving forward one day at a time. The letter from the bank sat in a drawer now, not on the table. A settled fact rather than a looming threat. He was outside repairing fence crushed by snow. The physical labor was a balm. The rhythmic thud of the post driver a way to pound his restlessness into earth. Kodiak was with him. The gray shepherd was not the stoic, grieving shadow he had been. The red ball had changed him. He was, in a word, a dog again. He lay in a patch of muddy, thawing grass, head on paws, eyes bright. The red ball, slick with slobber, was tucked between his front legs. He would whine a low, playful sound, nudging the ball, waiting for Garrett to throw it. Not now, boy, Garrett murmured. Kodiak sighed, pure canine impatience. He picked up the ball and trotted away, tossing it in the air for himself. That was when his head snapped up. Garrett didn't hear it at first. He just saw the dog. Kodiak's body went rigid. His ears, which had been floppy and playful, were now radar dishes locked onto the main road a mile distant. The red ball dropped from his mouth. Forgotten. A low rumble started in his chest, not aggressive, curious. Garrett grabbed his hammer. "What is it, Kodiak?" Then he heard it, not the familiar rumble of his truck, not the high-pitched whine of a helicopter, the sound of a different engine. A struggling older engine gears grinding as it made the difficult climb up his poorly maintained access road. A visitor. Garrett's hand tightened on the hammer. He was not angry, just wary. Kodiak didn't bark, just stood body tense but tail starting a slow, uncertain wag. Watching. A full minute passed. Then an old blue Ford pickup truck, its bonnet pockmarked with rust, its muffler complaining, emerged from the tree line. It was not a vehicle of wealth or power, it was a vehicle of work. It pulled to a stop 20 yards from the cabin. The engine idled for a moment before dying with a sputtering cough. Garrett and Kodiak stood their ground. The driver's door creaked open. A heavy work boot caked in mud planted itself on gravel. Then she stepped out. It was Belle, but it wasn't. This was not the pale, terrified, paralyzed woman from the Aspen cabin. This was not the sharp, defiant, well-dressed woman who had faced Dominic on the porch. This woman wore faded denim jeans, a simple wool sweater the color of sage, sturdy Carhartt work boots. Her blonde hair was tied back in a practical, messy ponytail. Her face was clean of makeup, cheeks whipped red by spring wind. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked thinner, tired, but she looked real. She closed the truck door with a soft metallic click. She did not move toward them, just stood by the truck, hands shoved deep in pockets as if to prove she was holding no weapons, offering no gifts. Garrett Thorne's heart was a stone in his chest, heavy but no longer frozen. He walked slowly toward her, the hammer still in his hand. Kodiak stayed at his heel for exactly 3 steps. Then the dog's control broke. He let out a sound, a high-pitched, strangled, agonizing sound of pure, unadulterated joy, a whine of disbelief and hope and recognition. "Kodiak," Belle said, just his name, her voice breaking. It was too much for him. The weeks of confusion, the ghost of his friend. The red ball, that was fun, but not her. It all broke. He exploded forward, a gray and tan blur. He did not bark, did not growl. He flew across the muddy yard, his paws slipping, kicking up dirt. Belle dropped to her knees just as he reached her. He collided with her chest, not with force but with desperate need, his paws on her shoulders, his face burying itself in her neck. He whined, he cried, he licked the tears that had suddenly sprung to her face. "Hey, boy," she sobbed, wrapping her arms around his thick ruff, holding on as he wriggled, his tail a frantic blur, his entire body a testament to pure, uncomplicated forgiveness. Garrett just stood, watched. His hand still clutching the hammer went slack. Kodiak, as if suddenly remembering his manners, pulled back. He ran in a tight, joyful circle, his paws slipping in mud. Then he seemed to remember one more thing. He ran back to the spot near the fence where he'd left the red ball, snatched it up, ran back to Belle, who was still kneeling in the mud. He dropped the ball slick and dirty directly into her lap, then pushed it with his nose, his eyes bright and full of pure, uncomplicated happiness. "You're back. You're back. Throw it." Belle laughed, a wet, broken sound. She picked up the ball. Garrett watched his dog, his partner, the animal who had seen through her lie and then seen through his anger. The dog who in its simple, honest heart had forgiven her completely. He had been holding on to his pride, his anger, his grief like shields, and the dog with a muddy red ball had just walked right through all of it. He looked at Belle, kneeling in the mud, her face a mess of tears and dirt and joy, her hands wrapped around the toy she had given. A long, slow breath left Garrett's chest. It was a sound he hadn't made in 4 years. The sound of a wall coming down, of a battle ending, of a long, cold winter finally truly breaking. He dropped the hammer. The heavy tool thudded softly on wet earth. Belle looked up, her face frozen, waiting for the verdict. Garrett Thorne looked at the woman, at the at the red ball. He was tired. For the first time in his life, completely, utterly tired of the fight. But he was also maybe ready to try something other than fighting. He spoke, his voice rough but not cold. "I can't take the money back." Belle shook her head quickly. "I know. It's not yours to take. It's done. The bank, they were going to take this place. I couldn't." She trailed off. "I know." He paused. "I read the news about Dominic." She nodded. "He's going away for a long time. The FBI found 8 more women, 17 total. They're all safe now. Silence. Garrett looked at the cabin, at the land, at the mountains. Why did you come back? He asked. Not accusatory, just curious. Belle looked down at Kodiak, who was pressed against her side, vibrating with happiness. I came back, she whispered, to see Kodiak. The dog's ears perked at his name. Garrett's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Just the dog. Belle looked up at him then, her blue eyes clear and honest in a way they'd never been before. I came back because this is the first place I've ever been where someone saw me, not my money, not my company, not what I could do for them. Just me. And I ruined it, I know that. But I had to come back and tell you that what you have here, she gestured at the cabin, this quiet, this honesty, it's the most valuable thing I've ever seen. And I'm sorry I brought a lie into it. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, a single sharp gesture toward the cabin. Get inside, Belle, he said, her name rough in his mouth after weeks of silence but no longer hostile. You're getting cold. Belle's breath caught. Are you sure? The dog's sure. That's good enough for now. He turned and walked toward the porch, not looking to see if she would follow. He didn't have to. He heard her footsteps in the mud behind him, and he heard the happy, joyful clicking of his dog's claws trotting right between them, the red ball in Kodiak's mouth. Inside, Belle stood by the fireplace, her wet boots leaving muddy prints on the floor Garrett had scrubbed clean just that morning. She looked at the photo of Carolyn on the mantel. I'm not replacing her, Belle said quietly, not turning around. I know that. I could never. I know. Garrett hung his jacket on the hook by the door, the same hook where Carolyn's field vest used to hang. You're not here to replace anyone. He crossed to the kitchen, started the coffee maker. The familiar ritual. Belle turned to face him. Then why am I here? Garrett looked at her, really looked. At the woman who had lied to him, betrayed his trust, and somehow still managed to do the right thing when it mattered most. The woman who had burned down her own life to save strangers. Who had paid off his debt not to own him, but to free him. Because, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, you saw what this place was, what it meant. And even though you lied about who you were, you told the truth about that. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. And because the dog likes you. Belle's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Just the dog. Garrett looked at her, at the cabin, at Carolyn's photo, at the quiet that was no longer empty, but no longer suffocating either. We'll see, he said. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. But it was a start. Kodiak, as if sensing the shift in the air, dropped the red ball at Belle's feet and barked once, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. Belle picked up the ball and threw it. It bounced off the far wall. Kodiak chased it with abandon, his claws sliding on the wood. Garrett watched them, a small smile finally breaking through his weathered features. Outside, the snow continued its relentless melt, feeding the streams, waking the earth. Inside, the fire crackled. The coffee was hot, and 3 souls, 2 broken, 1 loyal, began the slow, careful work of becoming something other than what they had been. Not whole, maybe, not yet, but heading in that direction. And as the afternoon light slanted golden through the windows, Garrett looked at the geological maps on the wall, the ones Carolyn had marked up with notes about sediment layers and fault lines. Belle noticed him looking. She would have liked you, he said quietly, surprising himself. Carolyn, she always said the strongest foundations are built on broken stone, pressure and time turning fragments into something solid. Belle looked at the maps, at the cabin, at this man who had every right to hate her and was choosing slowly, carefully not to. I'd like to hear more about her, Belle said, if you want to tell me. Garrett nodded. Maybe, in time. And that was enough. The quiet had changed. It was no longer empty. It was no longer a tomb. It was full, full of possibility, full of the work of rebuilding trust, one small, honest moment at a time. Kodiak brought the ball back, tail wagging, eyes bright. And for the first time in 4 years, Garrett Thorne threw it again, and again, and again.